theme that keeps seeming to arise in my mind, and gets reinforced a little bit by some of the things that we've been talking about in various discussions, is the theme of truth. Actually, Lung Pa was talking a bit in relation to that at our Owada, the talk he was giving at Patimokkha this afternoon, specifically around the truth of the way things are. And just thinking about the whole broad range of what that word brings up. That word refers to Pali being satya, S-A-C-C-A, satya, truth, one of the 10 paramis, one of the 10 spiritual perfections that we have to develop to at least some extent in our forming a basis for our practice. The Buddha often talked about satya parami, the truth parami, as being one of the most significant, most important. And the one that he actually never broke in his quest as a bodhisattva, developing these paramis to their fullest. And it was, something that the Buddha brought up over and over again, such as in his advice to Rahula, his son, about whatever you do, don't tell lies. Concealing things is one of the worst things that one can do for one's practice. Deceiving oneself, deceiving others is a firm basis for living a life of confusion and conflict and difficulty. So there's a lot of different layers of satya, of truth, starting with the basic level of precepts. We take one of our precepts, just having recited them, a precept to refrain from lying. And it's in its fundamental form, it's so important. Refraining from speaking falsely in any kind of conscious way. In the Patimokkha, the rule is, telling a deliberate lie is a pachittiya offense, an offense of confession. And there's some ways that it's further defined in for the monks' rules that's applicable to the lay precept as well. But basically, in any moment of consciousness, or when one is aware of what one's doing, if one knowingly and consciously tells a falsehood with the intention to deceive, then that is a confessable offense. And you can it's very easy to see, all of us here can see the effects that lying has. It just creates a whole sense of distrust and confusion, and is very disruptive to relationships in general. So we make the effort not to do that and to acknowledge it and confess it when we do that. And how much, it is, how much easier it is to feel like you can be in relationship with people if you have that sense that you're not going to, people aren't going to consciously try and deceive you. The trust level is much greater with that. So there's different ways other than kind of conscious, deliberate lies that we can, express falsehoods or confuse ourselves as well. It's good to kind of keep some of the more subtle ones in mind, such as we can often get involved with speaking too quickly, kind of unconsciously telling a lie, based with a pure habit of some sort of defensiveness or confusion underneath it. So somebody criticizes us or says something we don't like to hear, and we have an immediate emotional reaction to that, and then we act in terms of our speech immediately without thinking clearly enough, and maybe say something that's not quite true in a defensive posture. And we find ourselves shading the truth or just speaking in an exaggerated way that's not quite a deliberate lie. It's not a conscious, deliberate lie. But the fundamental underlying basis for it is of one of maybe hedging the truth a bit so that one is spared being seen in a bad light, or you just kind of exaggerate or blurt out something that's not quite what it should be because you don't want to admit that actually there's some truth in what that other person says. So we find ourselves getting defensive and saying things we shouldn't say. And that's a really common habit. And in some ways, in some aspects, if it's not conscious, then in terms of the patimokkha rule, it may not actually be an offense. But I remember going through recognizing that in the first few years that I was a monk, and realizing that actually there were quite a number of times when I found myself either exaggerating something or reacting a bit defensively and not quite telling a lie, but not quite telling the truth too. And it became quite disturbing as I was seeing that happen more and more. And a very useful thing was to, whenever I recognized that happening, would be to actually confess it with somebody, even though it wasn't a full-on offense, to actually confess it. Just as a way of bringing attention to that, how easy it is to react quickly and speak on the edge of falsehood. So that was very useful, and it brings about a greater sense of peace of mind when one is able to just kind of put that out there and say, yeah, that really wasn't quite the fact, wasn't quite the truth. We can also sometimes get involved in withholding information, not speaking, when there's a situation where we should own up to something, or maybe bring something to mind, or bring something to the fore, for the same reasons often. We want to conceal something that is either hard for us to accept, hard for us to see, and or we don't want to embarrass ourselves in front of other people or have people think of us poorly. So rather than say something that would be useful for ourselves and possibly useful for others, we just don't say anything. And in most cases that's not actually an offense, but in some cases it is. One of the situations, like actually concealing an offense is an offense itself, and particularly in one of the monks' set of rules of a set of serious offenses called the Sanghadisesa offenses. If one not only commits this offense, but also conceals it, then the sort of the penance period where one is undergoing certain observances in recognition of that major offense, it's multiplied by the number of, the length of time that one has to do these particular procedures is multiplied by the number of days that one actually conceals the offense. So every day an offense is concealed adds a day to the observances that one has to undertake to help absolve oneself from that offense. And so you can see how the Buddha was not only saying, there are certain actions that by body and speech that are considered quite serious, that need special recognition procedure by the Sangha, but also that the act of concealing it really ups the ante, that kind of hedging the truth by not bringing it to the fore makes it all that much more serious. So you can see in all these different ways the importance that he laid on truth, owning up to things in an honest way. Of course, speaking the truth wraps itself around the whole, all of the aspects of right speech. And speaking the truth is the foremost aspect of right speech that forms the basis for it, but there's also other considerations when one is speaking. And one of the things that comes to mind is a line we chant from the Metta Sutta about qualities of people that are useful to develop, particularly in terms of developing a loving kindness, heart of loving kindness. And it's straightforward and gentle in speech. So that first word, straightforward, is put right out there. We should aim to endeavor to be straightforward with what we're saying, not hedging the truth in any way for the harm that it does. It's also, I think, notable that gentle is in there, and it's so important that when we are speaking truthfully, that we're also speaking kindly and gently. This culture is one that tends to hold up an ideal of outgoingness of, I guess this is clearly related to a book I've been reading called Quiet. It's about introverts. And it's a pretty nicely done book, I think, and the power of these different kinds of personality types and how we affect each other, introverts, extroverts, not to oversimplify and overclassify personality issues, but she was making some pretty good points, and that this culture, this country of ours, Western culture in general, particularly in these days and times, tends to really emphasize the ideal of the extrovert, people who are highly energized, outgoing, engaged, and all the different aspects of personality that go along with that. But that there's an interesting, quieter minority, a substantial minority. I think she maybe estimates around 30% or so of people could be classified as true introverts, with all the range in between, of course, as well. But that the emphasis of being straightforward and almost to the point of kind of like in your face is really held up in some ways and culturally emphasized, and people who aren't quite that way are often seen as weak or just not as valuable as people who are very socially engaged and speak often and in certain intensity. Just pointing out some of the differences in how people, when people are interacting with each other, and how important it is to kind of know who you're talking to, so that if there's a certain point and you value being straightforward, see how the delivery is coming across too. And if you're talking to somebody who might be more on the introverted side, the message may get totally lost if it's coming across too forcefully. So we have to be gentle in our speech, and that's not just to be, sensitive to those people who may not value or have that same predilection for, exuberant, in-your-face kind of speech, but for everybody. There's a certain bluntness that can sometimes come across if we're feeling like we want to share something with somebody, that particularly if we're pointing out something that we perceive to be a problem or a fault or some issue, a personality kind of a thing that a person feels like they should point out to somebody else, or a way they're interacting, and to realize that people are sensitive, people have feelings, and that if you just kind of aren't very careful with your speech, but you're intent on, quote unquote, telling the truth, telling it the way it is, then the impact on the recipient can often be one of just shutting down, and the message is lost because the person feels flooded from the emotional impact of blunt speech. So just to be aware that speaking the truth is good, but we have to be careful in terms of context and time and place. And is it beneficial? Is it ultimately beneficial, or are we just trying to get rid of some of our own, negative energy? So truth, yes, but we need to be clear about the benefit, the timing, and the way that it's delivered. And he's talking about withholding information. There's other ways that, sometimes we withhold truth too when we think that somebody may not be able to hear something that is truthful or factual, and so we decide not to say it. And sometimes this comes up, say, when people are, come up oftentimes in the hospice work I would do, that sometimes family or the physician would feel like a patient shouldn't be told of their terminal diagnosis because of the fear of the effect that it might have on them. And generally speaking, time and time again, it was shown that that's not generally a very useful technique. Perhaps in some issues where people are very have some very strong loss of mental faculties, memory, late stage Alzheimer's or things like that. There may be some consideration around that, but generally speaking, you shouldn't withhold something that people should know for fear of how they may react in terms of something like a terminal disease, because people do have coping mechanisms much more than oftentimes we think, and oftentimes the fear of mentioning something isn't so much is more of a reflection of how we are fearful of not wanting to have to engage or have to discuss something like that. So in that kind of a situation, withholding the truth is not very beneficial. So yeah, there's two sides to that aspect of it. Sometimes it's useful to withhold what you're going to say because of the timing and the benefit, but other times it's important not to do that. So those are kind of some of the aspects of truth, such in the way of speech, sort of how we externalize it, act on that as a value. and as a parami. Then there's also the internal aspects as we start to look inside of ourselves, how we live internally, and the level of clarity that we want to see with our own intentions, with our own activities of mind, and how easy it is to get involved in not seeing things that we don't want to see inside of ourselves. Certain patterns of reaction occur inside of all of us based on conditioning, of course, and if something painful arises in our consciousness, oftentimes there's this immediate reflex of trying to not have to see it, to deflect it in some way through some sort of internal negotiations. Oftentimes it's referred to as the internal lawyer who's taking the central seat and arguing about something that comes up in the mind as a way of trying to defend oneself from a painful thought, a painful memory, or maybe somebody has, say, given us some feedback or criticism that we don't like, and so the immediate reaction is that internal lawyer coming up with all sorts of reasons why it's not true. The person who said it is all mixed up and coming from their own confusion, or it's just we think, oh well, I couldn't be like that. It's not how I see myself, and somebody pointing out something to me goes against my view of myself, my opinion of myself, so they must be wrong. So the internal lawyer can be very active in defending ourselves from dukkha, from the pain of hearing something that we don't want to hear, or the pain of remembering something that we don't want to remember, of a difficult experience that we had in the past that kind of surges up in the memory, and we will do ourselves all sorts of injustices by not allowing it to come fully into consciousness. So not wanting to own up to the truth internally. I got a real good hit on how important it is to kind of counter that. In one of the first retreats I went to, I remember I think it was an Ajahn Sumedho retreat here in California, and just spending a lot of time with a lot of unpleasant experiences, a lot of walking meditation, sitting meditation that was just totally agitated and unpleasant, and didn't seem to me at all like what meditation was supposed to be. All sorts of things coming up, and just really suffering immensely from that. And I'm sure it was triggered by something that Ajahn Sumedho said in one of his talks, but I remember at some point when things were getting very low, walking back and forth. It was outside the Angela Center. I have a very clear vision, memory of it, but walking back and forth and finally just getting so fed up and so frustrated that what came up in my mind was the question, well, what's really going on? What's the truth? What is the truth right here and now? What is happening? What am I, going through? And taking that, kind of surrendering to giving up the ideal of what it should be, what my meditation should be. I should be experiencing bliss. I should be experiencing concentration. Where are all the jhanas that I've read about? All of those kinds of things. Or where's the peace of mind? It's more of the question that seemed to be really useful was, well, what's the truth of the matter right now? And the truth at that moment was, I don't like this. The truth is, this really sucks. The truth is, I don't want to be here, I don't want to be doing this, I want it to be different, it shouldn't be this way, is what I'm feeling. So what's that like? And then it just gave the space to open for myself to experience, well, this is the way it is right here and right now, the truth of the way things are. And just acknowledging that, the truth of the matter, no matter what it was, is incredibly freeing. So, and this is starting to get to the heart of the Four Noble Truths, the basic structure of the whole Buddhist practice is centered around developing, understanding, penetrating these Four Noble Truths. And the first one being the primary one that we start with, the truth of suffering, and really acknowledging that, yeah, there's a lot in life that is not satisfactory. And of course, there is a reason for it and a path to end it, and the truth that it can cease. But needing to really see things clearly, the way they are. Again, Ajahn Pasana was mentioning this afternoon that he was recalling a photograph of Luang Por Sumedho holding a sign that basically said, "It's like this." So as a good memory that we have to keep turning our minds towards accepting the way things are, as a way of uncovering the habit patterns and the dukkha that we layer on to human experience. And our duty is to penetrate that, to know it fully, to accept it, accept the truth of that unsatisfactoriness, right to the core, right to the heart. So we can see, from our recollections in the chanting too, the definition of dukkha is defined in there. What is dukkha? Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha. Birth. So often we celebrate human birth, and it is in a conditioned, in the conditioned realm, the human birth is one of the most precious ones. It is the most precious one. It gives us the full opportunity to see both happiness and pain in such a way that we can learn to transcend them. We still have enough faculties that we can use as a human being to really see and penetrate this. We're not suffering intensely, and we're not filled with absolute 100% bliss. There's a good 50-50 mixture. So in a way, birth is in the human realm is a good thing if we're going to be taking birth anywhere. But the actual process of birth certainly isn't very pleasant, neither to the baby nor to the mother. Giving up that 9 months of swimming around in a nice warm protected environment, and then all of a sudden being thrust out into the cold, blaring, unfriendly world certainly isn't a happy experience. And certainly for the mother, labor and delivery is very, very intense, one of the most intense, painful circumstances, and it's only through the good grace of oxytocin that surges into the bloodstream after the birth that helps obliterate the memory of how unpleasant it was. That women tend to remember the good things about it rather than the pain and difficulty. So, but the actual process is very intense and painful. So birth is dukkha. um, aging. We start to see that in ourselves. The aging process as life goes on is not filled all the time with happiness and bliss. The body starts to get older and infirmed and frail. No matter what we do, we're all on the same treadmill. It just keeps going in the same direction. Nobody's getting any younger. Mark was telling us yesterday about his experience on one of the places where they're doing some surveying, one of the archaeological sites, I think it was, and was saying that they were told not to move or remove any of the artifacts. And when someone asked, well, what's the definition of an artifact? It's anything that's over 50 years old. So he was thinking that if he keeled over and died right there, they'd have to leave him since he's an artifact. So just remembering that many of us are actually in that category now, if not fossils. And it comes with its attendant aches and pains. I was thinking the other day that we're doing so good these days with our diet and our medications that all of our internal organs were really extending into much older ages. We're able to live much longer from all of these interventions that we do, but we haven't quite crossed the line in that same way with the external, the bones and the muscle tissues, and so we're creating all of these healthy inner organs to support these frail and decrepit, deteriorating skeletal systems with, bones crumbling and nerves getting pinched and weakness in the muscles and those kinds of things. So just kind of almost a diabolical plot to make us suffer physically into old age. But whether that happens or not, illness comes. And this body just isn't meant to last. And then the truth of death, that none of us lives, beyond our 80, 90, 100, rarely into the hundreds years. The human body just doesn't generally last that long, and with that, process, the attendant difficulties of the dying process, particularly being a culture that doesn't want to look at that, wants to avoid that. We create a lot of dukkha by not owning up to that truth. And how freeing it is to be able to start considering the processes of aging and death as just part of nature. If we can really own up to it, own up to the truth of what it's like to have a human body, appreciate it when it's working, use it as a tool for investigation and realization, the precious opportunity we have with the human body, but also accepting the absolute incontrovertible truth that it is going to go its own way someday. It's just the law of nature. There's nothing unnatural about aging and death. It can be unpleasant, it can be difficult, but we don't need to add a layer of suffering by trying to pretend that it's not going to happen. That it's just part of nature. And we don't need to expect it to be any other way. The truth of knowing and seeing things as they really are, as they truly are. Association with the disliked is dukkha. It's easy to try and pretend that we would all be better off if we didn't have to associate with people and events in our lives that were unpleasant, and we spend a lot of time trying to avoid that. and always trying to associate with that which is pleasant, association with the light. Or being separated from the light, I guess, is the dukkha as it's defined. So that when we have good situations, we're in a good living situation, we have a good job, good spouse, good partner, whatever it is, and then it's forced away from us through, being fired from a job or retired from a job, from a livelihood, or losing our house in a fire, something that's close, that we rely on and that we that we appreciate having, or even more so in the realm of human contact when we lose people that we're close to through death or through divorce or separation, growing up, moving away, whatever it is, the separation of that with which we hold too closely is painful. And the more we resist that idea, the more we add a layer of confusion and difficulty to something that is built into the system. There's always going to be a pain with separation. It can't be any other way, but we don't have to add an added layer of resistance, saying that it shouldn't be this way, it's not fair. Not getting what one wants is dukkha. We spend so much of our time trying to get what we want and trying to avoid the opposite of what we don't want. All the worldly winds. We want pleasure. We don't want pain. We want material gain. We don't want to experience loss in the material realm. We want praise, we don't want blame, we want to have people see us in a good light, we want people to think of us, we want to be successful, we don't want to be seen as somebody who's unsuccessful or have a bad reputation. So we bounce back and forth over and over again by not accepting the fact that if you invest in one, you're going to get the other as well. They come in pairs. Things can't always be pleasurable and supportive and friendly, and we can't always be enjoying people seeing us in a good light. When we invest emotionally in seeking those out, then we will also experience the pain of not having them when they're not there, when things change. And then we keep going back and forth between those extremes, trying to avoid one and trying to get the other. And we, resist seeing the truth of the matter, that it's a 50-50 world. If we attach to one, we'll get the difficulty of the other. So looking to see that as something we can own up to again, a truth that there is no lasting satisfaction in these being bounced around by these worldly concerns, and learning to see the truth of that, and not in a way that throws one into a depression or, well, what use is living? I might as well just kill myself. But as a way of saying, well, this is the best it's going to be in a world of changing conditions, in a world of uncertainty, changefulness, that is an inevitable characteristic of the world around us. So that's really starting to look, deeply into the cause of dukkha, the noble truth of the cause of dukkha, the attachment, the clinging, the craving, that is the basis for our difficulties, or the unsatisfactoriness and the instability, is so important to see clearly. And when we see that very clearly, how things are constantly changing from good to bad, from bad to good, and it's just the natural course of events, and that if we don't see that, don't accept that, then we're caught in trying to hold things stable, hold things steady, creating a sense of security in a world that's inherently insecure. It's inherently changing, trying to create stability in a changing world. That's dukkha. And that ultimately we don't have absolute control over it. That nature just follows its course. And there's no personal control over the inevitabilities of what it's like to be living in the human realm, to be living in samsara. So is that, again, what's the truth? Facing up to it, acknowledging it, seeing it the way it is. And there's freedom in that. So yeah, that's the third noble truth is that fact that actually this kind of unsatisfactoriness, this kind of suffering, there is a way to allow it to fade away and cease by seeing the truth of it. And we just get to the point where we don't want to engage with that ping pong effect of always trying to avoid pain and seek pleasure, and that we find that neither of them are ultimately fulfilling, and that leads to a sense of dispassion, a sense of disenchantment, dispassion, to the point where if we've also concurrently developed our meditation and start to be able to see how we can settle into more long-term a more long-term happiness by turning away from the very changeable world of the senses around us and moving more towards a stability of inner peace and inner calm, that when we get to that point of realizing that there's really nothing in the conditioned realm worth attaching to, worth hanging on to, and that sense of disenchantment starts to grow. Been there, done that. Don't need to keep doing that over and over and over again. And the sense of turning inwards, turning more towards a very stable, long-term sense of peace that can be attained through letting go of the grasping, letting go of the craving, letting go of the wanting things to be other than exactly the way they are. And in that realization and in that emotional release from holding so tightly on to our habits, there is a real deep sense of peace and freedom that is, beyond even any kind of conditioned sense of peace through meditation techniques. It's that actual seeing things, the truth of the way things are, knowing and seeing the truth of the world around us that leads to that sense of letting go and turning towards that unconditioned, that which isn't dependent on or involved with birth and death. And the Buddha's teachings are that when we realize that completely and let go of all of the obstructing factors from letting us completely let go, then when that full letting go happens, there is that complete and unalterable peace of mind. So this teaching on Satya, truth, we take it from the very fundamentals of our speech, all the way through our internal processes of owning up to what's really going on, and then taking it to the full penetration of the Four Noble Truths in their completeness. And in some ways you can see that fully developing this parami of truth can take us all the way to liberation. So I think I'll leave that for this evening's reflection.